Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for jumping into the webinar here tonight. I know that this was a little bit different from our normal process, and I'm so excited to see that we have a live audience tonight. It's a great pleasure to have the director and producer of Roadrunner, Morgan Neville. So Morgan, please jump in. Hey,
Hey.
we have real flesh and blood people out there somewhere in the virtual space. I'm very excited to say. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know we have about a half an hour. So if you want to ask questions, put them in the Q&A box, and I'll just read a few as we go along, and we won't have time to move people over as I sometimes do. So just make sure you ask your questions there, and I'll get to them in just a little bit. So Morgan, thank you so much, first of all, for making this movie, and second of all, for joining us.
Of course.
Anthony Bourdain is an absolute hero of mine. I'm a huge fan of travel, weird food, and exploring other cultures through their cuisine. And Bourdain was just absolutely, especially later in his life, someone who really, I think, allowed us to experience so much of the great things in the world virtually through his experiences. And, you know, his life story meant so much to me, and it was such a wonderful thing to be able to live it through your film.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the more I thought about it, I kind of realized that he was a documentary filmmaker himself. So, he was making, episode by episode, little films about different places around the world. And so I felt a real kinship with him as a subject going into this. Like, I felt like we were doing the same kind of work. But he was also this incredibly complex, interesting character who I'd always been interested in, though I never met him. And it was just the biggest rabbit hole to go into to actually try and tackle this film.
So, when you're watching the movie, some of the footage is so intimate that, especially in the early years, when it's not like someone was making a film about his life, when before he's sort of the global icon that he became. So,
actually,
oh, they were.
They were.
They were.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so tell us about that. How did you come across that?
So, he published an excerpt in the New Yorker called "Don't Eat Before You Read This," that got a lot of attention. And then somewhere between that and maybe it was right when Kitchen Confidential was published, a photographer in New York named Dimitri Castring started making a documentary. He's like, "How can I follow you around?" And he wasn't, he didn't have any money. He just had like a little PD 150 video camera and started following Tony around. And they started, he kind of followed Tony for about a year, and then he never finished the documentary. And so a lot of that early footage came from the 60 hours of footage that he had, of little mini DV tapes in a box that, as a filmmaker, it's kind of amazing to have those finds where suddenly you could see the end of kind of the old Tony, the last of the Kitchen Confidential Tony, the last of those days. So yeah, that was just one of those really exciting discoveries to make as we were putting the film together, that all existed. So they're actually, yeah, even though he was not famous at all, yes, there was a documentary crew there.
So I have to ask, because you must have gone through, I can't even fathom how many hours of tape after that, from all of the stuff that was shot in the years that ensued.
Yeah. I mean, our estimate is we went through about 10,000 hours of footage.
So, okay, is there any way for a documentarian to strategize going into that sort of abyss of footage?
You have to strategize.
So what is the way, how do you work on that?
Well, there are a few things. One is I had a lot of specific ideas about what we were looking for. And the thing is, there are a lot of kind of funny scenes or kind of, like, a really memorable restaurant or something that if you were doing a greatest hits show, you would use. But I kept saying, we are not doing a greatest hits album. We're actually trying to tell a story about Tony. So I'm looking for the moments when Tony is learning or changing or growing, something where we feel like something is revealed about him in a scene too. And, because those kind of greatest hits scenes are pretty easy to find because people talk about them all the time. And that there were certain episodes that meant more to him, things he had written about. He often would do little blogs about episodes. So it became pretty apparent which episodes he was particularly into. And plus, in all the other footage, the raw footage, everybody we interviewed, we'd always say, what do you, in your memory, what are you remembering? What are the things, the scenes, the places, the trips that stuck with you? And so as much intel as we could gather. And then the other thing was, I told everybody who was helping me look at footage, there were 6 of us going through footage, that anytime we eliminate something, that is a victory. So in a way, it was less about, oh, let's find everything that could possibly be good, and more, let's eliminate everything unless it's not great. Mm-hmm. So just trying to kind of whittle it down, and then kind of daily we would send each other, oh, look what I just found. I just found this really cool clip. And so it was just this process of trying to chew through it. But I think you have to have a fair amount of intention of understanding what you're going for if you're going to wade into something with that kind of archive, because that was an ungodly amount of archive.
So I'm also very curious about the relationship between, the archival process and watching and researching versus the interview process. Do you do one to inform the other? And if so, which is first?
It all kind of happens at the same time. The way I like to work is we started the archival, but it took us more than a year to go through the archive. So, we couldn't do that first and then start to make the rest of the film. So, we started the archive and we're learning. Another big part of it for me is, reading every interview he gave, rereading his books. I made a 20-hour playlist of every song he ever mentioned. I went and rewatched every movie that was on his favorite movie list and reread all the books that influenced him. Like, just getting all of that kind of going, and then starting interviews. But I filmed the interviews kind of gradually over a year, so that, and this happens all the time, I feel like in the beginning when I start doing interviews, I'm a novice, and by the end I'm an expert. And the sweet spot's actually somewhere in the middle. Where you're, what's happening, but but in an informed way. But I kind of feel like you have to start doing the interviews to learn exactly what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. And at some point, you hit gold at the right moments when you're doing interviews. I'm also somebody who tends to do a lot more interviews than I actually use. And not because I like wasting money or people's time, but because I'm trying to learn, and I learn a lot from interviews I don't use necessarily. And sometimes, oftentimes those interviews almost go into the film and then get cut out and you don't really know. And I also am a believer in having a fairly tight number of interviewees in a film. And particularly on this film, I felt like I wanted people to really understand who everybody in the film was, like what their relationship to Tony was. Yeah. And they're introduced both with archive, and so that if you think about it, you should know exactly how everybody in the film fits into Tony's life. And particularly because part of what the film became for me was kind of a reflection of the impact his death had on the people in Tony's life. So I wanted the audience to feel like they had a relationship with the people talking, that they're not just talking heads, they're actually characters in your film. But you can only introduce so many characters that way in a film. So even though I shot probably 33 or 34 interviews, I think we ended up using 18 in the final film.
I'm curious if there were moments, I guess, after you'd seen a decent amount of the archival footage, where you'd spoken to someone who was either one of the really the long-standing collaborators, or someone who was really intimately a part of Tony's life, that sort of made you look at the footage differently, because so much of I think what the film does is you're sort of looking for a sort of clue into how he may have been feeling at any sort of given point in time. Obviously, we sort of know where things wind up going, but you never know what's in the heart of another human being, really. So all we
No,
can do is listen to the people that loved him. So I'm just curious if anything
yeah,
changed your perspective along the way.
sure. I mean, particularly in specific episodes. You know, and there are things I didn't even use, but things I was looking at. You know, there's an episode he did of The Layover, this short show he did in Amsterdam, where he got totally stoned in a coffee shop in Amsterdam and just kind of froze and said, "Everybody's looking at me," and of course it's because he was being filmed. You know, but that it kind of was indicative of this feeling he had in his life that, you know, he was always being observed. You know, and there are things like that I wouldn't have necessarily seen in the raw footage unless somebody had pointed me to it. I mean, the scenes in West Texas, we have footage of him sitting by the fire, kind of sad late in the film. And that's because the director of that episode told me a lot. I mean, that was kind of one of the hardest episodes for Tony to do. It was done in the last few months of his life. And he just talked about Tony really kind of in a dark emotional place throughout that whole episode. And sure enough, you know, you see it there, you know, and even, you know, he told me the story that there's this footage of Tony kind of sleeping in the tall grass by a river in a canyon. And he said Tony had gone out the night before, and if I'm not incorrect, I think he said he snuck into Mexico with some people who wanted to go party with him and took peyote. Oh, wow. And then stayed up all night and came back for the shoot, but was like a wreck. And so, you know, those are the kinds of things you can't see in the footage, but you can see once you know those things, you can, you know, see the impact those things have on him, you know. So, you know, lots of things. I mean, all these different stories about, you know, when somebody would tell him he was full of shit or wrong, you know, that was always good. And there's even another story where somebody told me that, again, these are all things that aren't in the film, but, you know, there was this scene they were shooting in, I think it was Portugal. And he was going on about how great this crab soup is. And, you know, and the owner of the restaurant was sitting with them and saying, thank you. And, oh, this is the best crab, yeah, you know, and afterwards the director went to the kitchen and said, okay, can I get close-ups of you guys making the crab soup? And the chef said, well, we don't have crab soup. He said, well, what was that? And he said, oh, it's like a scallop thing, but, you know, and he said, well, why didn't the owner say it? And he said he didn't want to disagree with Tony, you know. And there's that thing that also happens where when you're somebody like that people just kind of go along with you. It's like that distortion, you know, reality field that happens when you're famous. And it's also part of what Tony talks about in that Haiti episode, which is like the struggle of how you're trying to film something without affecting that thing at the same time. And I think there was a lot of that with the show, particularly as it became more famous, of like, how can I have an authentic conversation with somebody without it being about me necessarily? And that became more and more difficult.
I wanted to ask I don't really know much about who you did or didn't manage to get interviews from. Was there a time at which you approached Asia about doing something on camera?
I never did. It was something we had a great debate about. And a lot of it is, that part of the story is actually way more complicated that I go into in the film. And every time I started to open that door on it, it started to spiral out of control, meaning that people just started asking 10 more questions. There's an alarm, a siren. People started asking more and more questions, which weren't actually about Tony. They were just about like, well, why did that happen? And why did that happen? And once I realized if I put her into those scenes, then she'd give her version and they give their version. And then I'm litigating these events that aren't actually giving me any insight into Tony. And so I just felt like the film would kind of end up in this narrative quicksand at the end. And so I just kept sticking with Tony. What was Tony thinking? You know, and I, you know, it was after a great amount of thought, that was the decision I made.
Okay, I'm gonna just quickly, I'm seeing that we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in, so I just wanna quickly see if there's any that we wanna jump into. Oh, who is the artist that throws paint on his, so yeah, okay, so this is David Cho, right?
Yeah, David Cho, who
Where is that mural, by the way? Is that in LA?
it's in LA, it's in Lincoln Heights. We actually painted the mural
Oh,
because my producer is a painter, and so we got a wall, she painted it, and then Cho came and defaced it, just because I felt
you didn't want to defeat someone else's work?
It just feels that to me actually would be problematic ethically to destroy another artist's work.
Yeah.
So we created that for David to destroy. Yeah, but David's a LA-based artist. He has a crazy TV show on FX.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yeah, the Cho Show, one of the most insane TV shows that's ever been on. So you can check it out.
And there's another mural, the one that's up on Highland, right across the street from the Hollywood Highland complex,
exactly.
That's behind a restaurant or something.
Yep.
Let's see. This is a good one. Did you ever try to interview his daughter, and how is she doing?
I did not. I mean, I kind of left that up to the family, and I said, if she wants to talk, I'd be happy to talk to her. If she didn't want to talk, I didn't want to pressure her to, because I mean, my daughter's the exact same age, and there's something slightly, or more than slightly, exploitative about trying to interview a girl who was 11 when her father died. And am I kind of exploiting her pain in a way? Again, like, if she was into it, I would have done it. But I also know, and this is the other real reason, is that Tony and Ottavia had decided, him being as famous as he was, that they were not going to show her face ever. Even when he did that family cookbook, they never showed his daughter's face. And so they gave us all their home movies, but they said, after a certain age, when she really starts to look more like, really that age is like 9 or 10, they just didn't want to show her face, because they wanted to preserve a certain amount of anonymity for her. She's actually doing extremely well. I mean, her mom is a badass, and there are a lot of people who really kind of love her and look out for her. And, people from Tony's world who are still very close, and they just say she's an awesome kid. So who knows?
I'm going to paraphrase this question from Chris a little bit. How did you get the people close to him to open up and talk with you on camera so intimately? So let's maybe expand that a little bit, which is, what is your approach to interviewing people about someone that was, obviously very important to them, who's no longer, with us?
Yeah, I mean, interviewing for me is like one of the most important things I do, and it's actually one of the most invisible things I do, I think. I think a big part of it, honestly, is, this is the secret to it. It's listening, like real listening, like listen as hard as you can. So what that means for me is that even though I prepare, basically my process is I do a lot of prep and about who they are and their relationship and all of that. But then I really digest that down to kind of a list, both of things I want to ask them about, but also I kind of usually have a running list of themes or questions for the film, which can be, travel, childhood, addiction, whatever, these kind of themes that I know I'm going to grapple with in the film. And so I basically end up with a piece of paper in my hand that just has words, like 45 single words. And then when I do the interview, I never look at it. So, my whole thing then is, when I'm doing the interview, I'm just having a conversation. Like, if they bring up something, we'll just go there, and we'll go. And then I'll ask tons of follow-up questions. And I think it's, for somebody to feel like they're really being heard and engaging in that way, like you're having a really great, intense conversation, is how I like to do interviews. And there are all these things that people do sometimes in interviews where, they ask people to rephrase, can you put the question I've asked into your answer? I hate that. I hate doing anything that kind of breaks the spell of the fact that we're just sitting here having this conversation, that you just forget about all that and we'll just go and go. And I really kind of try and keep eye contact as much as possible and just feel like which I am truly interested in what they have to say. But I feel like if I go into it with too much of an agenda, then it starts to feel artificial. Like it's not an interrogation, it's a conversation. And that means sometimes I don't necessarily get through everything on my list I want to talk about.
Yeah.
But I feel like if I respect the natural ebbs and flows of how somebody wants to talk about something, I'll get to a more interesting place. And on the balance of all the interviews I do, I'll get everything I need.
Well, you said that you sort of find the sort of golden spot, like in the middle, from when you've started your interviews towards when you're wrapping the last ones. So your list of keywords, it grows, presumably based on that process. What words did you add to the list that weren't there in the beginning?
That's a good question. Usually it's kind of subdividing a word into more specific words. So, maybe it would have been a word like addiction that then I would maybe subdivide into obsession and addiction, things like that, where I'm just getting a little more granular about things, and beyond. Just even things like, Tony definitely had a certain amount of OCD to him too, but then all these other things, the positive things too, that maybe if somebody would tell me a story, I'd be like, oh, there is this whole other thing that I don't really know about, whether it's, so for instance, kind of how he gave notes in edits and kind of his involvement in the editorial process of the show and how that evolved. That's something that, I guess, I was kind of vaguely aware of it, but then it kind of comes more into focus and you start kind of drilling down when you're talking to more and more people about it and kind of chasing ideas. And then I also am generally editing while I'm shooting too. Particularly if I'm taking a year of editing, I probably shot for 4 months. So I probably shot about half the interviews and then I started editing and then I shot the other half of the interviews over the first really 6 months of editing. So I like being able to have a conversation with the edit and the shoot. This is part of what documentary can do so well, is that you start to learn things as you're editing that you can then go back and start to get from the next person you're talking to and the next person. And so you kind of have this healthy feedback loop going between the shooting and the post-production.
Did you pretty much know the full list of who you were going to interview and then you split them based on scheduling reasons, or does that just really evolve as you're going?
It evolves. Some of it's logistics, and availability. Some of it is, there are people like Chris and Lydia, the husband-wife team that were his longtime production partners. Lydia was the first day I shot, and she was so good and so intense, but I definitely was just learning so much, like it was just a big dump of everything for me, which was great. So her husband, Chris, I said, I want you to be one of the last interviews I do, because I knew they had a kind of a similar experience. So I really wanted to have one at the beginning to help teach me and then one at the end to do the mop up of all the things I couldn't ask Lydia about because I didn't know. So sometimes I do stuff like that, but I don't get overly precious generally about kind of the order of interviewing people.
Did Lydia comment at all about how incredibly informed your interview with Chris was?
Yeah, well, she knew. It's interesting because they never really talked to each other. Even Lydia told me that when I did that first interview, she said, Chris and I have never talked to each other about this.
Wow.
In part because when Tony died, their whole business was suddenly kind of in jeopardy for a minute. And he was they kind of built their company around him. And so they spent, 6 months just trying to kind of figure out who they were without Tony. And she said, but we never really took time to sit down and have like a deep talk about our feelings about it. So they both talked to me before they talked to each other. which was interesting. I mean, there were a number of people who did interviews with me who said they had never really talked to anybody about it, because even if somebody knows somebody close to you, say, committed suicide, you don't often have permission to just sit down for hours and tell somebody exactly what you're feeling about the whole thing. I mean, that's a burden for somebody to hear it. So I think a lot of times people feel they shouldn't talk about it, and particularly around things like suicide, there are all these fucked up emotions like shame and guilt and things that people have, that they should have done something or should have seen something, and you don't talk about it. And, I mean, that was the thing I didn't fully anticipate when I set out to make the film. I mean, I did not understand just how deep into being a grief counselor this film was going to be.
Well, there's a question here from Imelda that's in fact asking about Tony's chef friend. I forget his name off the top of my head.
Eric or David, or
who also didn't want to speak about.
Eric Repair.
Yeah. Was there anything? I mean, was he just even off camera, not willing to go?
Well, Eric didn't want to do an interview initially. He's never done an interview except for the one he did for me. And he was the one who found Tony's body when Tony didn't, respond the next morning, and the hotel manager and Eric went up, and I can only imagine how horrific that was. And again, like, I don't want to be, exploitative about his feelings, but the fact that he was willing to sit down, I totally respected, and I understood why. I mean, just how painful that was for him. But I also felt like I needed to include him saying he didn't talk about it, just because people could understand where he was drawing a line in a way. I mean, he has to live with that for the rest of his life. And he also said, like Ottavia did and several people, that he was never going to talk about it again. So he actually told me afterwards that he felt he had said too much. I mean, we had, of course, a much longer conversation about a lot of things. But it was not easy for him. But again, like, I don't feel like I'm trying to trick people. I actually feel like I want them to feel like I'm on their side, like I'm in the trust business, that I want people to feel like, they can be vulnerable with me because I'm going to respect their vulnerability. I mean, that's kind of a gift if somebody's vulnerable with you. And I mean, that's part of my process of making a film. People can do it different ways, but I think it's part of why I get good interviews, hopefully, is that people feel like, I'm somebody they can confide in. And if they say to me afterwards, like, I really shouldn't have said that, then I don't want to trick them into it. So, though usually, I mean, that doesn't happen often at all. And usually if it's something I actually care about, which it usually isn't, usually the thing they regret saying is something that I don't really care about. It's something tangential. But occasionally when that happens, people generally, if I need to make an argument, which has happened a couple of times, I usually win. If I can explain why I need something.
Yeah. I know it's late, so I just want to throw in this one last one from James. Many of us feel an odd emotional connection to Bourdain without ever having met him. Did you have the same experience? And if so, how do you balance that with the need to maintain a certain degree of objectivity as a filmmaker?
I mean, I know I'm a filmmaker. I mean, I've made films about characters that I am attracted to. Like, I don't know if I could do, I mean, I've done definitely flawed characters I like, but I don't know, to do like a film about Dick Cheney or something, like, I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could spend 2 years, like on Dick Cheney or, and I like watching those films, but, I mean, so there's always, but I kind of feel like it helps me understand what I'm interested in, like, oh, I want to know that, or I'm, you know, a lot of what I kind of respond to is just my taste. Like, oh, Tony loved all this music, but like, but I love that song too. So let's, you know, the Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence song we put in there was Tony loved that song, but I love that song. And it was like this point of connection. And then I found the clip from the movie that we stuck in there for a beat. But I don't feel like, I definitely don't approach things like a fan though, you know, because I feel like making films for fans is generally limiting. I mean, I think more often than not, I make films for the non-fans. You know, I mean, I'm not specifically about this film, but I mean, a lot of times I've made films about a subject that people didn't think they were interested in. But the people who care about the subject, the people that care about Tony are going to watch the film and hopefully like the film. The people who maybe only had a casual acquaintance with him, and I've talked to many people who didn't really know that much about him, who had never read any of his books or things like that. You know, they were hooked into the film too. So, you know, I wanted to stand on its own legs.
Well, that begs one last question, which is, for everyone out there who may be really discovering Bourdain a little bit more beneath the surface level than sort of hearing the name out there, do you have a favorite from all of the episodes? You know, something that you can steer people towards?
I mean, there's some great episodes. A couple of things. Well, first of all, if you haven't read Kitchen Confidential, that's basically his life up until this movie begins. So I feel like it's the perfect companion piece, and it's a great read. I mean, the book came out 20 years ago, but it holds up. You know, it's a really funny, raucous book. But for the shows, I mean, a couple of episodes we didn't get into, but like the Iran episode was one of the most important episodes he ever did. You know, taking an American TV show and sitting down with families there. And there's a scene where he's having a dinner with an Iranian family, and he says something about the axis of evil, and this Iranian man says, you know, we're not the axis of evil, we're just ordinary evil, like everybody in the world. It's so great. So that's a good one. I mean, there's so many cool episodes from, you know, Bhutan to, you know, I mean, really, the Vietnam episodes, and he did several, were deeply meaningful to him. I mean, Vietnam was kind of his happy place in the world. So he's so blissed out there. Those episodes are great to go watch. And so many people go to Vietnam because of him. I mean, I've not been to Vietnam, but it's the top of my list because of this film. As soon as I can get there, I'm going to go.
I can't, I mean, I've been to Vietnam, not because of Bourdain, but you know, in this film, you know, you definitely can feel exactly what about Vietnam he connected with from my experience traveling there. So I recommend it to everyone as well. It's a wonderful place, and amazing food, amongst many other qualities. Thank you so much, Morgan. This is just a phenomenal film. I'm really glad we got to share it. And thank you for joining us and staying up late.
Of course. Great talking to you. Take care.
Everyone. Thanks.